are the first parliament in Australia. We have a number of traditions that date back to the 1830s.
A lot of people don't realise that the Parliament is open to the public. They walk along Macquarie Street, they can walk in the doors.
Parliament House can be a very busy place. At any one time, we have 300 employees working in Parliament. During a sitting day, with members of Parliament and their staff being here, that number will extend to more than 600.
Within Parliament, we have 10 different outlets. We have 2 restaurants. We do cocktail parties. Every section can be absolutely pumpy. And we do close to 100,000 meals a year.
The Parliamentary Library has been much loved by members of Parliament since 1840. It's a legal deposit library, so everything that's published in New South Wales is here. If not the oldest library in the country, it's one of the oldest libraries, so the historical collection is very impressive.
When the House is sitting, my role is to make sure that the chamber is set up for the day. In the Parliament, tradition is utmost importance. Our system of government is the same as the English version, so a lot of our traditions have carried from there, and we cannot sit unless that black rod is on the table in the chamber.
The parliamentary precinct consists of more than just a heritage building. So what's now known as the Tower Block was built in the 1970s, and it was put in place to accommodate members and their staff. Connecting the Tower Block and the 200-year-old building, there's the beautiful fountain, and that's the space where we have a lot of our public groups coming through. And all of that connected together is the working parliament that we have today. One of the areas where it's traditionally been very difficult to balance a political career has been around especially young children. I think it's incredibly important we provide the facilities that help members balance those two competing priorities.
The bells go, that means Parliament has to sit.
Honourable members, the Speaker.
We acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we represent and thank them for their custodianship of country. I encourage people to come and experience democracy in action in the New South Wales Parliament. They can come into question time.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and we are taking this very seriously.
Can the Premier update the House on what the government is doing to address traffic congestion?
Our community knows that we will be there for them today.
We want an extension of time for 2 minutes.
Point of order.
One of the major roles of the Legislative Council, the Upper House, is our committee system. The members of the Legislative Council will take evidence from members of the public, from experts, on a number of vital issues that are important to our state.
Passage of legislation is actually quite a physical process.
The bill passed.
Even in a modern digital technical world, we still have a paper bill that the clerks walk across from the Legislative Assembly to the Legislative Council.
Once the bill hits the floor of the House, it's time for the Legislative Council to do its work of detailed scrutiny. Ultimately, a bill cannot be sent to the Governor for assent until there's been agreement reached between the two houses.
People talk about parliamentary privilege, and one of the great privileges is to be the clerk.
Every day when I walk into this building, I walk along the Premier's corridor with those photos of the Premiers on either side since 1856. Literally, some days I pinch myself at my good fortune to work here.
I just love the fact that I get in here every day, and understanding what a difference you're making for the people of New South Wales is just an incredibly motivating part of the job.
I love my job because I'm surrounded by the most amazing people.
The Parliament is the people's place. And the 93 members in the lower house and the 42 members in the upper house are all here for one reason, and that's to represent the New South Wales public.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Legislative Assembly and a very enthusiastic audience here for the third of the Bear Pit. This is an initiative brought into existence by the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, Jonathan O'Dea. I'd just like to acknowledge he's here present and to thank him for his invitation to this chamber to present this third in the series. Today we're going to be talking about, a round of applause for the Speaker. It's important to understand the purpose of this. It's a way to look inside the life of Parliament, some of the issues that people contend with, not with the extreme conflict that can exist in a very theatrical sense within this chamber during question time, and maybe slightly lesser so in the other place, but really to see how politicians, when they're thinking about things as citizens, wrestle with some of these issues. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose country we meet, to acknowledge their stewardship of the land, the sea, the air, the things seen and unseen, and to pay our respects to their elders since time immemorial, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge Vivid Ideas, for which this forms part of the program in this year, and of course the staff at Parliament House who've helped us in putting this together. Today we're joined by 6 guests: Rob Stokes, Amal Awad, Jihad Dib, Gabriel Upton, Jonathan Safran, and, Rose Jackson. Sorry, Rose. Yeah. We'll be having a conversation about the role that religion and politics play in our society, and particularly how it affects people working in the Parliament of New South Wales. So let's get to the conversation. Amal, the question of religion and politics, it immediately strikes a chord with a lot of people. But I think if I could start off with you with a question about religion. I mean, is it clear what we're talking about here, or is it a more complex kind of issue before we even get into the question of politics itself?
Well, exactly. Religion is not a blanket experience. You know, there is the practical element, the practical life of a religious person. Oh, sorry, is the mic not on?
No, it's on, but you have to speak up.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I'll try to sound good and yell at the same time. Essentially, when we talk about religion, you know, I think that the initial response is to think of very stern, indoctrinated individuals who have very particular views on life. Whereas I think religion is actually such an interesting concept because we can have religious fervour about a lot of things. In terms of government or politics and lawmaking, are we talking about religious law, or are we talking about people who have religious leanings in politics? You can't separate that. It's not an accessory for a lot of people where they suddenly are not Muslim or they are suddenly not Christian in their job. I guess the question for the public is how much is that person influenced by that, and can they be more neutral where harm can sort of occur for people if your beliefs interfere with their freedom?
So religion is a more subtle thing. It's not just a block. We're not necessarily talking about the kind of the formal doctrines or rules of religion. You're thinking more about it here in terms of the sensibility a person brings.
No, I'm saying that it's both. I'm saying it's not just that. I think that you can have a problematic experience of religion in government or politics or law, whereas I think a Prime Minister talking about praying isn't a problem. Like, that's okay if he wants to pray. It shouldn't be mocked for that. So I think what I'm getting at is this idea of, when we talk about religion, what are we talking about? Are we saying that a politician can't have a religious belief system? Or are we saying that, you know, we have to make sure that that politician in some way is I guess, overseen to make sure that their personal preferences are not overriding the need of the collective, and that's what your job is, to serve the public. And so if, that's where we encounter the bigger problems. What I have observed sometimes is a bit of mockery towards people who have religious beliefs, which I think is kind of sad, because it's, to me, a bit discriminatory to suggest that somebody who believes in something doesn't have logic or the ability to be a skeptic or to ask important questions or apply reason or logic. So it's really hard to not be crude in summarising what I think, but it's not this or that. It's that we have to be a bit more open-minded, I suppose, and expansive in our thinking when we think about religion and its place, because you are ultimately serving a public that has a lot of religious beliefs themselves. And I'm sorry, but the atheists can be as severe in their belief system because not believing can be a belief system as well, as somebody who has a belief in God or in deities of some kind.
Gabriel Upton, why do you think there's this popular maxim that religion and politics should be kept separate? I mean, certainly people say if you're at a dinner, don't talk about those two things. Why is it they're rubbing against each other?
Well, they are interrelated. And I think you put it so well, Amal. You talked about it could be a code of ethics or a framework within which you operate and you've developed over time. It could be an institutionalised practice of a religion. Politics is an intensely personal thing. When you stand as a candidate, although you stand as, in most cases, a representative of a party which has some tenets of it, at the end of the day, your electorate in the lower house where I sit is electing you as an individual. And we have an election process where the electorate, where you stand, has a chance to interrogate who you are, what you stand for, ask you those contentious questions, get to know you. You know, if you come to politics like I did when I was in my 40s, you've had half a lifetime. I was educated in a religious school. My family were, I would say, practising Catholics, not devout Catholics. I take that with me through my life. And when I stood for politics, I had to become very clear about my essence, because that would frame how I would go about doing my job every day. And it was unlike any other job I'd had, because when I'd worked in banks or I'd worked as a lawyer, you know, I had the brand name, I had the title over the door that said who I was and what values I had. In politics, you bring all of that with you, your religious framework. And I do think it frames who you are and how you relate to issues that are brought to you. And look, you know, if inherently the party to which you belong creates an issue for you every day, you're in the wrong party. But I think on the social issues is where the divide in Parliament comes. And the last thing I'd say, Simon, is we have the most extraordinary debates in Parliament when we have conscience votes, which we've had 2 in the last year. And they show the best of our parliamentarians. We don't vote on party lines, we vote our conscience. And I was very clear with my electorate about what my vote would be. Not, you know, people in my electorate on those issues didn't necessarily agree with one another either, you know. So therein lies the challenge. Unless you bring the essence of yourself to Parliament, I think you're going to fail, and I think people will see through that.
I think I'll come back to the question of conscience votes later, because it's always been interesting as to why some votes are labelled as eligible for conscience and others are not, because they can actually have very serious impact on the lives of people. But we'll park that. John Saffron?
So can I just, on that, I actually object to the phrase conscience vote,
right,
because it indicates that, I know it's shorthand, but it indicates we don't use our conscience at other times. I think the better word is a phrase is a free vote, that it's not directed by a party. But I think we would all recognise we use our conscience every day on every vote, but it's just on some issues there's an agreement in the various party rooms that there won't be a party direction on how you should vote.
But to be real about this, different parties impose different degrees of discipline, and there may be some parties where if you are conscientiously objecting to something, unless it's a free vote, you'll be bound to vote as the party determines. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the consequences, certainly, I think Rose and Ajad would agree, in the Labor Party are much more, so it involves more bravery in the Labor Party in that context than it does in the Liberal Party, but the Liberal Party is becoming a bit more that direction as well.
Yeah. Rose, do you want to jump in on this, on the question about conscience versus free votes? We might as well go there since it's been opened up.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Rob that the phraseology conscience vote doesn't sit comfortably with me. I prefer the phrase free vote. I'd also agree with him that, you know, the consequences for Labor members who vote outside agreed party positions can be serious. But the discussions and the debates that we have within our party room are, you know, some of the richest and most thoughtful and most intellectual. It's a shame to me that that's not always aired publicly. It's a shame to me that some of the contributions that I would make in that forum aren't contributions that you would make publicly in the Parliament. But I think we can all understand the reason that that happens is so that we can speak freely, is so that there can be a sense of a space where you're able to express a range of different views, hear others, change your mind, say, actually, I accept your point and I'm going to go in a different direction. It's very difficult to do that in a formalised parliamentary structure. That's a conversation I think that this forum has had previously. Yeah. But back to the question of sort of religion and politics, I do think in a way it might be worth re-evaluating the relationship between what you might call free votes and conscience votes and the relationship with religious belief. Because it is certainly the case, if we're speaking realistically, that the issues on which we have had free votes, termination of pregnancy and voluntary assisted dying, are ones in which the reason a free vote has been given is because people require that in order to balance their commitment to their party and the parliament and their religious beliefs. So they do bring those questions really in to the spotlight. I respect those. I don't have religious belief myself. I respect those members who do and bring that to the debate, but I do think the important thing is that there is disclosure and transparency about that. I don't have a problem with the idea that in those questions people would grapple with issues of faith and allow them to inform their vote on those issues. I don't have a problem with that, so long as I think they're clear. They're clear with their community. Here's where I'm coming from and what you can expect of me. And that way, people can judge what they want from their members and make the decision where it matters at the election. If they're not happy with the way that decision has been informed, they have the right and they should say, no, I don't want you representing me anymore. But that requires transparency and disclosure about the way those decisions have been informed.
Jonathan, when you're listening to this, with the whole question about the public interest in relation to this, and you hear the debate about coming with a fully formed person with religious beliefs and the occasional opportunity to have a free vote or what's sometimes called a conscience vote, how do you think about this notion about the intersection between religion and politics, and why is it even an issue at all?
I find when people complain about religion and politics, they're really complaining about something else. And to explain what I mean is like the same left-wingers who'd kind of complain about Scott Morrison kind of speaking in tongues at Hillsong and saying, oh, Christ informs me and about that he wanted me to lead Australia or whatever. Same people would roll their eyes at that. If there was some Catholic priest at a Free the Refugees rally saying, oh, Jesus says, welcome the stranger, it's not like they're going, oh, no, keep religion out of this, keep religion out of this. So, yeah, I think I think the public's kind of a bit chill and just kind of works backwards from what they actually believe and whether it's going to serve their particular interest in this particular issue to sort of go along with what Jesus says or not.
So if they like the policy that the religion produces, then they're quite happy for religion to inform it.
Yeah.
Because it speaks to their own preference.
Yeah.
If they don't like the policy it produces, then they condemn it.
Yeah, and also because everyone who's religious not everyone, but people who are religious often work backwards. So it's like, they want more trams or something. So it's like, listen, Jesus would have wanted more trams. And
you can tell John
by the wildest of coincidences, Jesus always, has the same opinions that, they have in 2022. So, yeah. And also I think it adds colour to things. And like when you talk about religion, the two things that are sort of, it's hard to unpick is religion versus ethnicity. And so, lots of people, probably most people in Australia are pretty cool with ethnicity and people expressing their ethnicity. So it's like, where's that grey area where that crosses over, into religion, and the other thing is spirituality versus religion. So, so the same left-wingers who would roll their eyes at, oh God, you can't talk about religion and politics. It's like, well, what happens if an Indigenous Australian talks about their spiritual connection to the land? Like that whole debate is so infused with this whole thing of a spiritualness of, there's a spiritual connection to the land. So, yeah, it's just kind of here, and I think it's a matter of degrees.
Jihad, we haven't heard from you yet.
Oh, and I'm taking it in, and I find it hard to disagree with anybody at the moment. And I think picking up on the point that Amal had said and Rob had said and Gabriel, I suppose it's part of who you are, part of who you're being is you can't decouple yourself from everything that you've ever known, from what you believe in, from that very sense of purpose that you have from your inner self. And the first thing you do, particularly in Legislative Assembly, is you say, this is who I am. This is me as an individual. First and foremost, this is what I offer. This is what I stand for. This is what I believe in. Here's effectively my resume. If you support what you'd like to see me in Parliament, please vote for me. That's in its crudest form. You don't hide anything. I think the worst thing you can do is that you present one thing to the electorate, and it's our job interview every 4 years here, and then you come into Parliament and you go, well, you know what, I'm putting that aside and I'm going to be something completely different. The biggest challenges that we have, and certainly conscience votes, and I'd agree with all of my fellow MPs here, the conscience votes are the most difficult, but they're actually the ones that really ask you to search within yourself and to explain the reason that you're making some particular decisions. The issue of religion and politics is a vexed one, and ironically, when I put something on about this particular event on my social media, it was amazing because it was as what place does religion have in politics? And big response, none whatsoever, etc. The issue, I think, was lost. It wasn't about...
That was the dominant view, wasn't it?
It's actually just one word, none.
Yeah.
There was just none.
So the issue wasn't necessarily about what it does, but if the question was, does my belief, whether I have a particular belief or no belief, does that shape some of the decision making? Then absolutely, every one of us in life has a code of ethics by which we operate. Some are informed from religious practice, some are born from ethical, whatever it may be, we've got a particular code of ethics that we operate by. And I think the decisions that we make as individuals are based on what we personally believe in, as an individual. And a lot of those things are about the way that we would live our life. It doesn't mean that I put religion front and centre in every single decision I make, but I can't underestimate the fact that my particular belief, whatever that may be, helps actually formulate those decisions that I make and the person that I am. So it's incredibly hard to decouple. But on the same token, I don't think it's appropriate then to say, well, this is my thing and I'm going to push it on others no matter what. Instead, I'm very transparent, very clear, very articulate in the sense that this is why I'm making this decision. And this is based on all of those reasons. But I don't look at somebody who has got a different religious practice or no religious practice as being any lesser than me. If they're a decent human being, then they're going to be thinking those same ethical things that I'm going to be thinking and informed in a slightly different way.
Yeah, but are we just dancing around the central concern here? I mean, the reason why people write none is because there's some underlying concern, which is that a particular worldview grounded in religions, which make absolute truth claims. Religions don't say about themselves or about each other, well, we say this could be true, it's not true. They say this is the absolute truth. They make those claims in a way which are radically incommensurate with other absolute truth claims. And then people say, well, if you're carrying that with you and you bring it not just into Parliament but into government and you say you're bound by some obligation to give effect to those absolute truth claims, then you will, in fact, legislate in ways which may not necessarily advance the public interest. I think that's the deep concern.
Yeah. Can I actually answer to that?
Yeah.
Like, I find it interesting that if you don't have a religious belief, your beliefs are somehow considered neutral and acceptable. What do you believe? It's just because you don't believe in a religion doesn't mean your beliefs aren't problematic.
I suppose, though, to agree with you, the concern would be, take termination of pregnancy, where we weren't legislating whether any individual woman had to have an abortion. We were legislating whether or not that should be in the criminal code.
Right.
And members who were informed by a religious belief that abortion was wrong, which is fine, were voting that it remain in the criminal code. And to me, I will always say I respect it, but it is problematic because as a non-believer, why should someone else's belief that that's wrong? Of course it's not for them. They should never be forced to make a decision for them and their family. But why can't I make the decision?
But what if
for
a
me and
believer
me
does?
family?
What if a believer makes that decision too?
Oh, I mean, absolutely.
A non-believer, sorry. So what if a person who's not guided by religion, but their own inner stirring says, I don't agree with this, is that acceptable then?
Oh, absolutely. But in terms of absolutely. individually in the privacy of their own home or doctor's surgery. But I guess what I'm saying is that I'm not even necessarily, just sort of throwing it out there. The concern would be that people would take what are their individual religious beliefs, doctrinal teachings of their church, and bring them into a space which is secular, the Parliament, and allow that to inform decisions that other people can and cannot make because, that it's in the criminal law.
So which bit do you disagree with, Gabriel?
Oh, that Parliament's secular.
Right, so why do you think
I
it's
do.
not?
Well, we say a prayer every day. I mean, under the standing orders.
It's not secular, absolutely, I agree.
There is a prayer, and we've had a debate in the upper house, which Rose may... And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you. We actually have the great kind of respect for one another here as members of the Parliament. So, we frame every day we're here by a prayer. And then we acknowledge the Indigenous nations and peoples. And I think that's appropriate. So we have prayer groups in Parliament. So I don't think you can say this is a secular Parliament. It has a basis, a connection with religion.
But do you think it's a religious institution in any sense?
No.
No.
But it's informed by it in the way that somebody has a religious
I think the
belief
way
comes.
I'd see it is it's sort of like a Venn diagram. There's an intersection between people's spirituality, and I want to actually separate religion from spirituality because the problem, I can speak for myself, I would have a religious label, but that doesn't actually describe who I am. A bit like I'm a member of the Liberal Party. It doesn't mean I believe everything that the Liberal Party ever teaches. I've got my own views on things. And all of us, I think, are on a journey of spiritual learning. And so my views will adapt over time. I suppose the central belief that I have that drives me in public service, and I think it's shared by all people of all different faiths and none, is of love for others, and that is I suppose the communal expression of the faith I have. For me personally, I'm a Christian believer, and so I believe that I've got to love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, and mind, but also love others, and that's the outward expression of my faith. So one applies to me, and it's personal, but the other is how I use that to serve others. The thing that I find the hardest thing is my religious faith comes from a place of recognising my own frailty and imperfection. Yet the presentation of people with faith is that they actually condemn others, that they think somehow others are lesser than themselves. For me, that couldn't be further from the truth. I start from a position of my own imperfection, and then an expression is then, well, how do I love others? And I think that's what motivates most people in the Parliament, if they've got a faith or none.
And I think that's an interesting. I think that's a really interesting point, and a very important one too. That sense of religiosity and spirituality, and you could be spiritual in lots of different ways. You could be religious in lots of different ways. There's different levels. Sometimes we'll be labelled. So Rob, he may be labelled by his religion. I have often been labelled by my religion. Excuse me. What I ask is for people to go that little bit further, actually get to know the person behind that particular label, and that would apply for life in general. So in sense of spirituality, it's all guided by that idea of we are all here. Every single person comes to the Parliament for the very same reason. That is for public service, to serve others, to make the world a better place. Every single person. Now, for some, along the way, they maybe get lost in all of the other things that happen here, but that still is that idealism of what we all come in for. In sense of spirituality, you bring that, as I said, to your decision making. There are some times when your inner struggle is so strong that you say, look, I don't know how this fits in. For members of the Legislative Assembly, and I'm not sure how my colleagues feel about this, but I'm also then very cognizant of the fact that there's an electorate that I represent, and what are the views that they would like me to express on particular issues. And so there's different ways that you can ask them about that, and different ways to ascertain that. But most importantly, and I said this before, it's not, you can't look down at somebody because they're different to you. And it happens the other way. There was antagonism towards people of faith, as there has been antagonism for people of faith towards people of no faith. What I look for, and what many of my colleagues look for, is what is the person that you are? Like, what are the things that guide you? What are the principles that you live by? Your faith is your private thing, but it also doesn't mean that you should be ashamed of it, or you should be ashamed of having no faith. As long as you can actually stay consistent and be true to the person that you are.
I think anybody listening to this so far would say we are totally comfortable with the idea of elected representatives being whole people who have got a sense of their own place in the world, a spiritual commitment, and that be respected. What I think has troubled people historically is going back to, if you look from the time that the First Fleet arrived to colonise this place, the sectarian divisions that came off the boats, Catholic versus Protestant, the Protestant ascendancy, and how that then acted itself out.
But when you look at that, though, that was resolved in one sense by people of faith as well. Richard Burke and the Church Acts were an interesting governor because he was a Protestant but Irish, and so saw the damage of sectarianism, and that's where the Church Acts...
But it was that secular ideal that said, let's not let these debates within the world of religion, which in some senses are unresolvable at the level of faith, actually tear apart the polity. Let's have some standard by which we can do it. For example, at the moment, I think the Anglican Diocese of Sydney does not believe that women can have headship. That it says, well, they can't be in charge of things. Now, if somebody brought that into the Parliament and said, well, because I am of that mind, therefore no woman could be a premier or a speaker or whatever it happens to be, I think most people in the state would say, well, if it's not your spirituality we object to, it's that doctrinal position which is being brought in and now being attempted to be given legislative form. And should that be the boundary between the personal spiritual belief and the public expression?
It also depends on the religious tradition or history you're pointing to. I mean, if you go through the annals of Christianity, you go right back to the coin, which side of the coin you're looking at, and then the debates, Augustine, the city of God, the city of this idea of
just unpack the coin. You're talking about render unto Caesar.
Yeah, render unto Caesar. Yeah. But that's the fundamental, and that's where this idea, and it was debated through the later Roman Empire, this idea of separating the emperor from the church, which has, it's always been uneasy and all the rest, but very clearly there has to be, and that's where I said that Venn diagram idea, there's an intersection, but there are religious issues that have nothing to do with politics. There are political issues that have nothing to do with religious institutions. But I think throughout all of them, there's a veneer of your own human spirituality.
Okay, so we can accept there's that human. Do you think the separation between church and state in the way that Rob's just described it is a good idea?
I think you just described it yourself. It's an ideal. We're not there. Our society is reflected in our parliament. And at the end of the day, how evolved your society is, your public is going to be reflected in who you elect to represent that public. And I agree. I don't think somebody should be guided by their religion when it might cause harm to others to vote against something. But I'm at a fairly evolved state. I'm older, I'm wiser, I have ways of thinking about things, I suppose. I think there's something that really, if we can come back to this idea that really what we're dealing with is human nature. That's what politics is informed by. That's what religion is informed by. We're all little projecting machines going around spewing our thoughts out at everybody. And I think, John, you touched on this. Really, we're not objecting to someone else's idea. We're objecting because they don't agree with us. So I think if we can soften our stance a little bit to understand the humanity below all of this is what's bubbling under the surface of every action, every reaction, every thought. I'm not saying something is right or wrong. I'm saying this is the reality. This is what you have to deal with until you can get everybody in society to agree that neutrality is what we need, or a secular state is grand. You're just not going to get that because everybody's dealing with their own problems, their own outward ideas, their own experiences of life, and they're being informed by those problems. What socioeconomic state do they have? What was their upbringing? How much were they indoctrinated with ideas that are hard to undo or decouple? There's so many factors, and this idea that people can just slot themselves into some neutral state to be fair, it's just not going to happen.
We do that all the time. We introduce institutions to manage the conflicts that happen. I mean, this is a fantastic example of that. A parliament in which you have an opposition and a government, and they don't hit each other with, as they used to with swords and things. They argue across, and we've just seen a peaceful change of power because we put institutional settings which try to defuse some of the excess that happens if we just take human nature
Look
as
what happens when they don't. In America last year, what happened?
Yeah, well,
so what I'm trying to say is that nobody would have thought that would have happened. Everybody would have thought America would have a peaceful exchange of power. That's absolutely what the expectation is in the US. And then it took one person to disrupt that entire experience, because he was absolutely tapping into the anger that people felt at a time when a pandemic was raging and wreaking havoc. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I wish I could give you an answer of how to achieve this blissful state where we can fairly govern and everybody's happy. But until you have a public that is in that kind of equilibrium, you're not going to have that reflected in your government either. It's just the way it is. And we need, that's the goal. So how do we serve the public in a way where we're not serving ourselves? And I understand you have a base to serve, but what is your base also asking? What is your base asking of you?
Look, I don't think the issue is about the base. Obviously, you know,
into it, though.
Yeah, but you don't do it because of that.
Well, some people do, don't they?
Some people do. Well, I don't. I would say that I know Rob wouldn't. But what you also do is you have, you know, said you go there to an election, say this is what I stand for. I suppose the interesting point would be, and you raised this a bit earlier, Simon, you know, somebody who comes in here to make particular decisions based on religion and move particular legislation to move a particular agenda or a particular thought. Now, that is somebody who may, if they've campaigned on the issue, then, you know, they've got every right as an MP to do that. Whether that gets up or not is up to, you know, the 93 members here and the 40-odd in the upper house. But what I'm worried about, what I've seen more that I'm concerned about, is that it doesn't mean that, so that's one bit. But if somebody actually has faith, then let's not actually hold that against them. It doesn't mean that every single day walk in here and go, okay, what can I do to, you know, to further progress this in a legislative sense? They don't. It's just part of who they are. And there are sometimes very, very rare occasions in the parliament where you're called upon to make some decisions where you, as it reflect deep within. But the issue...
So do you think that people are... I want to come back. I'll come back to the church and state, because I want to hear what Gabriel and Rose think about that too. But do you think that people of faith are prejudiced against now? Because I mean, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, imagine if you'd looked at people sitting in these benches, nearly every one of them would have had to have belonged to some kind of religious or faith group in order just to get elected. I mean, it would have been, if you stood up and said, I'm an atheist, can I go to Parliament? It'd be wipeout. So do you think it's gone the other way now?
No, and I don't think it's that loaded, but I think certainly we've seen some arguments in the public space and in the public domain where the issue of faith and no faith has become very antagonistic, one way or the other. You know, we've got people of different faiths in this Parliament. I'm, you know, of a different faith to others. There's people of no faith. There's someone who's a Sikh here. And I think we actually enrich and reflect a little bit of what the society is when we actually show this is who we are here to represent. We bring a different viewpoint. It doesn't mean that every time Gurmesh Singh, for example, speaks, he speaks thinking, I've just got to push a Sikh agenda. Every time I speak, I say, I've got to push a Muslim agenda. Or Rob speaks, I've got to push a Christian agenda. No. I think it's just, that's that thing within. So I don't think that you're prejudiced against. In terms of society, of course, there's some rules and regulations that we can have that can be better. And I could talk about religious vilification till the cows come home. And particularly for women of Islamic faith who are vilified and there's no actual protection. But does that mean that if I say, get up and make a speech and say, I think this is a concern that we've got in our society, it's not just for those women, but it's to say, allow people to practice what they need to practice or to be what they need to be or they want to be and protect them, because our ultimate role is to create legislation that not only protects society but enhances society and
as a whole.
And creates an opportunity for everyone to succeed, to belong and to feel a part of it. That's actually the fundamental truth of every single person who comes into this place, knowing that their job is to make our society better, more equitable, fairer and successful for every single person, not just the people that I represent in Lakemba. It's just as important for me to make sure that the people in any other electorate can live their lives in the best way possible.
I actually think we have quite a good culture on that, Simon. I don't want to reflect on other parliaments, but, you know, I do reflect on the fact that when Dominic Perrottet became Premier of New South Wales, I mean, he's obviously known as a man of, you know, quite deep Catholic faith, although I would note some of the most fervent criticism of him has been from parts of the Catholic religion. I don't know if anyone's read the Catholic Weekly this week, but allow me to tell you it's got a very bad photo of him on the front, ripping him to shreds about voluntary assisted dying. But when he became the Premier, there was some, criticism in the public domain of him as a religious man and a man of deep religious faith. And Jihad will back me up on this. We were told in no uncertain terms there was no problem for us, as Labor parliamentarians and opposition MPs, don't go there. That's not a relevant part of the critique and commentary on him as a new Premier. And we were all very clear there were a range of reasons we wanted to have a go at the guy. Won't go into it. This isn't meant to be a partisan forum. But that wasn't one of them. And, it's noteworthy that there needed to be a gentle reminder, because there was that stream, that undercurrent in the public domain. But it was also noteworthy, I think, that we had a really good culture and a clarity from all sides of Parliament that we weren't interested in that being a central part of any narrative around him as Premier. And so, I think in some ways the conversation about church and state, it's a journey, not an outcome. We are on a journey. I don't have a Master's of Biblical Studies like Rob, so I'm not all across the history. But I do know... Or something fancy.
He's working towards it.
Something fancy.
He's working towards it.
So I don't know, all of the references he's making. Some of them go above my head. But I do know, somewhat, the journey through the Enlightenment, and here we are. There's not a place that we're going to reach. It's a journey. It's a constant iteration of, how far can one conversation go? How much do we express, our individual spirituality, our individual faith, the teachings of doctrinal churches, whatever ones we're a member of or not. It's a journey. It's not a destination. And I actually think, at least in the New South Wales Parliament right now, we're at a relatively positive place on that journey. And I think that's something that, is a testament to all sides. Gabrielle mentioned the prayer. I don't participate in it. I'm not a religious person. Do I object to it being read for 30 seconds, for other members for whom that's, a useful framework at the beginning of their day? No. And I think that kind of understanding and space that we give each other is a relatively positive thing.
And there was a debate in the upper house going back to, I think it was 2020, where there was a motion by the members of the upper house to remove the prayer, but it didn't succeed. But I think we are a secular society. And I really relate to what Rob said. We're in the same party, but that has nothing to do with it. In terms of like a Venn diagram, what are the influences into this institution where we kind of reconcile all these differences, all the diversity that is in our community, whether it's a religious view, a view of the world, your age, demography, whatever it is. Religion is one of those influences. And I'm respectful of people who come to the Parliament regardless of their beliefs. Some of that is no belief, fine. People of no belief still have a moral or ethical code which would guide them every day, and that's as much relevant as it is for those of us who are Christians here.
I was
just saying, Jihad and I were involved in a joint select committee, which was the biggest one by number that had ever been held in Parliament, where we referred out a bill by another colleague about whether there should be a protection for religious freedom in law at the state level. And of course this has been an incendiary debate federally, which they didn't achieve before the last election. But we were sent out to comment on a bill from one of our colleagues, and we had, I think, a committee of about 14 or 15. I suppose the point of telling this story is, firstly, we don't have a protection for religious freedom in New South Wales. We've kicked it down the road. I'm hoping that at some point our government or the next government will grapple with that, because we do have protections for other points of lived experience, if you want to put it that way, whether it's, your other diversities, whether it's disability, whether it's sexual preference. They're actually in an Anti-Discrimination Act, but we actually do not in this state have a protection for religious freedom. We made our report, which recommended that the government should act and should create a protection around this, because again, it was a part of what informs people's everyday lives, not just whether they go to church, because some of us may be Christians and not go to church. So I would like to see that land. But the point of mentioning this is also to know that we work on these issues in Parliament, but also that I thought was an amazing process. It was tough as chair of that committee, We had amazing debates. We had people of every complexion who are represented in parliaments representing, I wouldn't say every religion, but a diversity of beliefs. And we landed a position through what this parliament does, coming back to your really good remark. This is a way to negotiate, to sort out those differences of community. And it is, let's finish on a very positive note, which I am so grateful of in the way, to your point, that the last federal election, it's only 7 days or 9 days on, we're all sitting here. We're still able to go on with our lives. The centre-right, I suppose, or somewhere around that, the middle of the road is what normally frames a party who's chosen to lead our nation. But we should be very proud of a system that allows, which this parliament does, for a negotiation between those things. It spits out something at the end, whether it's a law, regulation, a statement the Premier makes, but it is a negotiated outcome and it doesn't suit everyone 100%. And as someone said to me in politics, if you've got one stakeholder who's saying they 100% believe what you're saying, you probably haven't negotiated a good outcome. If you've got most of your stakeholders say they have 70, I don't know, put a number on it, when it comes to a contentious issue, that's probably not a bad outcome.
John, where do you think, I think, as I said before, we've got agreement that people bring their religious beliefs and they shouldn't be favoured or prejudiced against because of that. But this notion about boundaries between the bringing of a belief which you hold as an individual and its influence on public policy, do you have any principles you look to how those boundaries ought to be set?
Well, on one level, everything is like a matter of degrees, but on one level, I think it's kind of cool. I mean, like, just personally, I like how I'm always disagreeing with people and there's people out there that have, like, there's going to be a disagreement. Like, that just keeps your brain alive.
But this is a place where laws get made, not just a debate. They can actually say this is illegal or you must do that. That's the difference between.
I guess so, but again, it's like everyone's. It's just it's a matter of degrees, and it's like, well, you're also going to have religious people who, if they'll just work around the system, they'll just kind of work out how to frame their argument, their religious argument, in a secular way to. And maybe they should or whatever, but like Catholics do that when they're talking about abortion, for instance. Like someone I've just seen online, like people who their shtick is that they're Catholic and they come from a Catholic perspective. But then when they really want to drill down on why they're against abortion, they reconfigure their arguments into these like secular arguments. So it's going to be there anyway, regardless of how it's framed. But just generally, I don't know. Like when I went to primary school, a state school, and it was a bit Christian-y, in that sort of state schooly way. Like we went to church a couple of times a year and lots of Christmas stuff or whatever. And I always thought that was kind of cool. It kind of like kept my brain alive because I'm Jewish or whatever. And I liked it because it just I like that kind of feeling of like me being challenged or like just a bit of like an elbow or whatever. And obviously everything, a sense of degree or whatever, but I just don't think it's a bad thing that you've got these.
So let me give a hypothetical.
Yeah.
So suppose a society decides to enact a law which infringes upon your liberty, something that you want to do. Mm-hmm. And the explicit reason given for doing so is because this is in accordance with God's commandments.
Yes.
Would you think that's an appropriate thing to do? If a majority of people in a democratic parliament said...
Obviously, as a writer and doco maker, I'd think that was awesome because I'd get so much material out of that. But I also think this...
Maybe in a less self-interested way.
But I think this other thing that was kind of touched on, but is kind of interesting, that might sort of answer this, but in a slightly different way, is the history of white Australia is like infused with Christianity, but it's been secular forever compared to like the history of white America, where it's like pilgrims come and stuff like that. So if there's like challenges to religion in America, it's from the white American tradition is about Christianity and stuff, and like you're challenging that. Whilst like, just to give one for instance, after World War I, when they built the War Memorial, there was in Melbourne, it's like, well, should this be a religious build, crucifixes and Jesus, and it was like, nah, we're going to make this absolutely important building secular. And there was a bit of a fight with the church or whatever like that. But anyway, I say that to like in 2022, if people were like suddenly going to do this pivot and be really like publicly religious and all this stuff like that, it just seemed like odd in the.
I know you'd be odd, but would you also think it's wrong that happened?
Okay.
Would you judge it? I want
What's the law? Give me what this law is where...
All right, I'll come to you with the same question in a moment, Amal. Well, it says, for example, that you...
No kosher bagel baking.
No bagels. Yeah, bagels are going to be banned.
The Christian theocratic state.
Or something more serious. I mean, it could have been around things like it had been the case around same-sex marriage or other things, but something that has an actual impact upon your life. Okay. But the explicit reason given in the parliamentary debates and in the legislation is this is because it is required by God to do so.
Look, this just proves what an honourable person I am, that despite that would be really great for my work, no, I'll go against it. You're not allowed to say we're passing this law because of God.
Okay. Amal?
I think we live in a cultist society and religion. We live in a culty society. Everything is a cult. Like, I remember seeing a video a few years ago of a woman who was in Jerusalem and she heard the call to prayer, the Islamic call to prayer, and she was crying and complaining about this is the land of Jesus and there's a call to prayer there. I mean, Jesus was from the Middle East, but so is Islam. And it was just wild that this woman thought that she had a right to that place more than Muslims. So you can't reason with that. You have to accept that there's something she's doing or thinking that is impenetrable at this point, and it's protecting her or safeguarding her in some way from dealing with life in another way. And this is not me trying to be judgmental. I'm trying to understand it. I'm like, who thinks that way? Because it didn't cause her belief any harm to have an Islamic call to prayer. But in her mind, an American woman, she had ownership over Jerusalem.
But come back to my question. My question is about you wake up in the morning and a law has been enacted in this parliament which infringes upon a liberty you formerly had, and the explicit reason is because God has commanded that it be so. Would you think that to be a reasonable thing?
Of course it's not reasonable.
No.
It's not an appropriate thing at all. But what the thing is, you have to then ask why.
No, but I want to know why it wouldn't happen.
Because it's ultimately secular.
Because you can't.
Well,
yeah, like
there's
you have
a variety and diversity.
Sorry, it could if you have enough people. I mean, the thing about democracy is if you have a majority of people who want to do that, you will do that. Unless you think there's something about the structure of the parliament or the conventions around democracy.
It's more like what Australia's like. Like I've hung out with these like real kooky people, for instance, from the far right who mean a lot of harm. Most of us would, and even they kind of know they can't get away with Jesusing up things, or like people will be rolling their eyes and stuff like that. So maybe I'm naive. You'll be able to play back this footage when a Christian theocratic state is enacted in Australia and say I looked really naive. But I just don't think it's going to happen.
So I think but isn't there like Islamic family law now that is available to certain people, and it's not for everybody. It's a very I'm sure I read something about divorce law in an Islamic context being, applicable to Muslims who wish to follow that path. I would have to do more research on it.
Maybe there is no law that I think of, but whether that's a potential context within,
the context
consideration.
Within. So
there are a number of different types of law that apply. Religious law, there's gets in.
But nobody's going to be
Judaism,
subjected to that.
The Catholic Church has a different view about divorce.
Yes.
In its own canonical law.
Exactly. So nobody's saying now you all have to follow Islamic law when it comes to divorce.
But this is different to the proposition I'm putting to you. I'd be interested to know why you think it could never happen. Gabriel, you said it just wouldn't happen. It's just that a matter of practice that no one would do that?
Or is
there anything about the principles
You wouldn't be so open about it.
A majority of people in both the upper and lower house would have to agree to that. Those people who are here are elected by their communities. So, it's a kind of a bottom-up model. You could, in theory, end up with that, but it would be because the will of the people had commanded that through their representational ownership of people who sit in these seats in Parliament, that something would be moved, it would be agreed to by a majority of people here, it would then have to be agreed to with the majority of representatives in the upper house. So I don't see that happening unless the community have that kind of view that is represented through the people they have represent them in the Parliament.
And the weakness of our system is the strength. There are so many paradoxes here. The Westminster system is based on separation of powers. so that we can't end up in a situation
like that,
totalitarianism like that. But this is the same of any religious institution or a secular institution like a parliament. They're created by humans. My belief is as humans, we have a shared frailty. So whatever we're going to design is going to be problematic. And there are plenty of examples throughout history of where parliaments have got it wrong, where religious organisations have got it wrong. But hopefully they are thirsting after eternal truth, even though the institutions that they're wrapped within are flawed. But that's why we need all those sorts of protections.
Can I just touch on, picking up Gabrielle talk about the Religious Freedom Committee, and it was a huge committee. I think we had it was about, you'd remember as the chair, but it was well over 20,000 submissions in different forms, whether they were extended pieces or short pieces. And the thing that we really came out with, that I really took away from that, was the idea that freedom isn't about using that then as a sword. It's got to be there as a shield, as a protection. And I think that's got to be a way that you think in terms of how do you make sure that any laws that you enacted to protect people, not necessarily to give people an opportunity to really make other people's lives difficult. And that's a really important point to make. And that's why hopefully when it does come back in a better way, it takes in a whole range of things, because it's in no one's interest to see one group of people be able to put it over somebody else and they've got the legal protection. What you actually want, come back to again, those basic idealistic principles of everybody having...
That is an ideal. There are some people who do wish to use their beliefs as a sword, and then it's secular and...
Yeah, and then it's our job in the parliament to make sure that we don't allow that to happen. In going back to the question about could this ever happen in terms of you wake up one morning and everything's a bit different, it's incumbent on us as a society to try and have a parliament that reflects as much as we can the image of Australia or the image of the state at any given time, because that reflection of diversity also brings that reflection of diversity in ideas, of diversity in experiences. And the more diversity and the more reflection of our society we have in our parliaments, the better we will be at creating, I suppose, laws and regulations that actually suit a whole heap of people. If you just have everybody from the one place with the one experience, then not everybody's voice is being heard. So that's a challenge for us as a society, to make this parliament look much more like it is when you walk out the door.
That's, I think, as I was saying, the threat of any kind of totalitarianism, whether it's rooted in ideology of a political kind or a religious kind or whatever. Members of Parliament that are in this panel, have you ever had to act against your conscience? Can I ask you, have you ever, any times where you've been brought to a point because of the discipline of your party to vote on something which you deeply believe to be wrong?
The issues that have created where we've had freedom votes that are free or conscience, I think, have given us that opportunity not to have that conflict. But the broader question of, ethical code, which goes beyond, or the way you conduct yourself in life, which doesn't go to doctrinaire religion. Sometimes it would be easy to say yes to people, right? No, there definitely would be easy to say yes to my kids as they were growing up, but there are some things, and I think that's it is the essence of politics and the extraordinary opportunity you have to understand more about yourself when you come into politics, because you do on a daily basis face sometimes questions about how you will navigate what's a complex place with complex competing interests.
Rose, have you had to?
Yes, I've had to. I mean, it's not necessarily a comfortable thing to admit to. I have found the experience of having to vote on issues of legislation with which I either had minor qualms or more deep, serious reservations, more frequent than I had anticipated. Maybe it's not smart to admit to it, but to be honest, I always prefer deep honesty. I had my say within the Labor caucus on every one of those occasions. I could sleep at night because I know I raised my voice in the forum where Labor was making its decision, and I was listened to and I was respected, but I was outvoted. And particularly as a member of the Legislative Council who's there on the Labor ticket, as it were, my constituency is all of you, is every member of New South Wales who's voting Labor in the Legislative Council. I am committed to the Labor team, and the majority of my colleagues felt differently on a couple of issues than I did, and I accepted...
It must hurt though when you have to do it.
It did. On those occasions, I was a member of the backbench, and so, to be honest, crossing the floor, as it were, or refusing to support the collective Labor decision would have resulted in my expulsion from the party. And they were decisions, whilst I felt uncomfortable with them, I wasn't quite prepared to throw away my entire political career where I knew I have so many more fights ahead. If I had been a member of the shadow cabinet, as I am now, and had the option of resigning that position in order to express my separate view, but not leave the party of which I have been a member for almost 20 years, love deeply, would chew the ear off anyone in here for an hour about why Labor, I may have taken that option, Simon. It wasn't available to me at the time. The issue was mandatory blood testing. The issue was legislation that this Parliament, the one that is forefront of my mind, is laws that required the mandatory taking of blood from people who had, for example, spat at first responders, against their will, holding them down, taking blood. Without going into the details, not the nature of this discussion, had a number of serious reservations with that, but I voted for it because that was the Labor position.
Am I to believe you're the only one? You've never? Gabrielle? Jihad? Rob?
No, not in terms of the free vote of the
disagreed
conscience
with, but not.
Yeah.
You've never felt the kind of burn or hurt?
Not that burn.
No, not that burn.
To agree with Rose, I think Rose got a very high, threshold for what she believes conscience matters are, which is absolutely admirable. There's plenty of stuff I disagree with, but it wouldn't elevate. I mean, the beauty of our body politic is on so many of the big issues. I mean, we often get criticised for not being different enough on things, but so many of the big issues we agree on. So some of the huge fights have been had, at another time in history. So there's a lot that we agree on. The threshold of conscience, I haven't reached.
The things that you could, and Rose touched earlier, you've got to raise your voice when you've got the opportunity to raise your voice, and where that comes in, whether it's a shadow cabinet meeting or a cabinet meeting or in a caucus meeting. And you've got to then say your piece, but you also then have to accept the will. You sign up going, I accept that I am one voice out of however many I've got in the caucus. What you don't want to do is walk out that room and say, I wish I said something, or I wish I disagreed with something, or go out and be critical of it when you didn't actually try and present either your viewpoint for a possible amendment or your viewpoint so people know that it was pretty clear how it was articulated. I haven't had a situation where I've said the free votes, but there's been ones where you just go, yeah, look, I probably don't feel as comfortable with that. The way that I've maybe reconciled myself is going, what is the greater good? And you're sort of looking at why do you not making that decision. But if you've got the voice, you have to use it. It's finding the right time to use it and the right context.
I think whether or not you have a religious belief or not, the moral courage that requires is quite extraordinary. Look, I'd just like to finish off by thanking everybody who attended and all those who have participated. It's a difficult topic in some ways. I really love the fact that we've got to firstly understand how a whole person is brought, and that the natural balance within a democracy is one of our greatest protections, so that it never takes to the extremes that some people fear of. Can I again thank you, Jonathan O'Dea, the Speaker of the House of Assembly, for initiating this series, Vivid for allowing us to be part of their program, my colleagues at the Ethics Centre and Doppler, and of course the staff at New South Wales Parliament House for facilitating this. But in particular, whether you're online or here in the audience, can you please join with me in thanking Rose Jackson, John Safran, Gabrielle Upton, Jihad Dib, Amal Awad and Rob Stokes. Thank you. What kind of society do we wish to be? For over 30 years, the Ethics Centre has been the leading independent advocate for bringing ethics to the centre of everyday life. That's because we believe that we can make better decisions as individuals, as institutions and society as a whole. But we need your help to continue. When Australia is on the cusp of a brilliant future, and I'd ask you to contribute to our annual appeal, so that for another 30 years, the Ethics Centre can be an independent advocate for bringing ethics to the centre of everyday life, because better decisions do make for a better world.